Two teenagers, Ethan Wilson and Malik Thompson, were sentenced to death for the brutal execution-style killing of Breonna Mitchell in front of her 3 children. Behind the shocking violence lay a twisted psychology that investigators would discover was fueled by a social media challenge to commit the most memorable crime in their neighborhood. The case would hinge on a single piece of evidence that neither teen realized existed, a recording accidentally captured on one of their phones that documented not just the murder, but their planning and laughter throughout the horrific act. On October 27th, 2 teenagers brutally murdered Breonna Mitchell in her living room while forcing her 3 young children to watch the execution-style killing in East Baltimore, Maryland. The victim, a 32-year-old single mother, had just returned home from her evening shift at Mercy Medical Center, where she worked as a nursing assistant to supplement her daytime job at a local daycare. Neighbors would later report hearing several gunshots around 10:15 in the evening, followed by the sound of children screaming. But in this part of East Baltimore, where the crumbling row houses stand in stark contrast to the gleaming harbor developments just miles away, gunshots were unfortunately common enough that they didn't immediately trigger calls to police. It would be almost 20 minutes before emergency services were contacted, not by neighbors, but by Breonna's terrified 8-year-old son. The 2 perpetrators, later identified as 16-year-old Ethan Wilson and 17-year-old Malik Thompson, had broken into the Mitchell home through a rear window approximately 30 minutes before Breonna arrived home. Security camera footage from a neighbor's house would later show the teens, wearing hoodies and bandanas, partially covering their faces, testing windows and doors, before finding an entry point at the back of the modest 2-story row house. The children, who had been watching television while waiting for their mother to return home, were quickly rounded up and confined to the living room sofa when the intruders discovered them. According to later testimony from the oldest child, the teens appeared calm and even joked with each other while repeatedly checking the time on their phones, making it clear they were waiting for someone. When Breonna Mitchell opened her front door at 10:12 p.m., carrying grocery bags and her nursing scrubs, she was immediately confronted by the 2 armed teenagers. According to forensic reconstruction of the scene, she dropped her belongings and raised her hands, likely attempting to de-escalate the situation when she saw her children being held hostage. Detective Harold Jenkins, who would later lead the investigation, noted that the living room showed no signs of a struggle, suggesting that Breonna had complied with all demands in an attempt to protect her children. Despite her compliance, the teens forced her to kneel in the center of the living room, directly in front of the sofa where her children sat. What happened next would shake even veteran homicide detectives in a city unfortunately accustomed to violence. Rather than simply robbing the home as one might expect in a typical home invasion, the teenagers took turns shooting Breonna Mitchell, firing a total of 7 shots. The medical examiner would later determine that the first shots were deliberately non-fatal, hitting her shoulders and legs, while the final shot to her head was delivered execution style after several minutes of watching her suffer. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the fact that the children were forced to watch the entire ordeal, with one of the perpetrators physically restraining them on the sofa when they tried to run to their mother or close their eyes. Evidence technicians would later find children's handprints in their mother's blood, indicating that after the killers fled, the children had tried desperately to help their dying mother. The 911 call, which would later be played in court, came from Breonna's oldest son, Darnell, who had managed to retrieve his mother's phone after the attackers fled. The 8-year-old's voice, unnaturally calm in a way that first responders would later attribute to shock, can be heard telling the dispatcher, "My mom is bleeding a lot. The bad boys shot her many times. We need help, please." When the dispatcher asked if the bad boys were still in the house, the child responded with chilling certainty. No, they left. They said they got what they wanted. They said we should remember their faces. Baltimore police responded within 7 minutes, arriving at a scene that would haunt them for years to come. Officer Regina Collins, the first to enter the Mitchell home, described finding the 3 children huddled around their mother's body, attempting to wake her up. The youngest child, just 4 years old, was still trying to press a small kitchen towel against one of his mother's wounds, not understanding that she had already died from her injuries. Evidence technicians would spend the next 14 hours processing the scene, recovering multiple shell casings, bloody footprints, and fingerprints that would eventually help identify the killers. The Mitchell children were transported to Johns Hopkins Hospital for physical examination and psychological evaluation, where social workers faced the difficult task of explaining to the children that their mother was gone while simultaneously trying to gather crucial witness information. Dr. Sarah Watkins, the child psychologist who first interviewed the children, noted that all 3 exhibited signs of severe trauma, with the youngest unable to speak at all for the first 24 hours. The 2 older children, however, were able to provide surprisingly detailed descriptions of the attackers, including specifics about their clothing, voices, and even snippets of conversation between the teens during the attack. What initially confused investigators was the apparent lack of motive for such a brutal crime. Nothing of significant value had been taken from the home, with Brianna's wallet and jewelry left untouched. Her modest television and laptop remained in place, and the only items that appeared to be missing were her phone, which was later found with the children, and a small jar of emergency cash she kept in the kitchen. This puzzling lack of a clear robbery motive would lead Detective Jenkins to consider whether the killing might have been targeted rather than random, possibly related to something or someone in Brianna Mitchell's life. As dawn broke over Baltimore the morning after the murder, the city awoke to headlines describing yet another homicide in a city that had already recorded over 300 for the year. But as details emerged about the circumstances, a hard-working mother executed in front of her children, the case captured the attention of both the community and the media in a way that many homicides in Baltimore, unfortunately, do not. Mayor Raymond Johnson held a press conference promising that every resource would be dedicated to finding the perpetrators, while community leaders in East Baltimore organized vigils and fundraisers for the now orphaned Mitchell children. The brutal, seemingly senseless nature of the crime sent shockwaves through a community that, despite its familiarity with violence, could not comprehend the callousness of forcing children to watch their mother die. Reverend James Washington of New Hope Baptist Church, located just 2 blocks from the Mitchell home, expressed the sentiment felt by many. "We have seen too much death in these streets, but this crosses a line that breaks our hearts in a new way. Those babies will carry this with them forever. What kind of person does this to children?" As detectives began the painstaking process of gathering evidence and interviewing neighbors, they were driven by the knowledge that 2 extremely dangerous individuals were still at large in their city. Brianna Nicole Mitchell was born on June 3rd, 32 years before her murder, to working-class parents in the Sandtown-Winchester neighborhood of West Baltimore. Her mother, Deborah Mitchell, worked as a hospital custodian for over 30 years, while her father, Marcus Mitchell, drove city buses until a back injury forced him into early retirement when Brianna was just 14. Former neighbors described the Mitchells as a tight-knit family who maintained their modest row house with pride, despite the decay that was claiming many of the surrounding properties. Brianna was the middle child of 3, with an older brother who would later be lost to street violence at 22, and a younger sister who had moved to Atlanta 5 years before Brianna's death, in search of better opportunities. Former teachers at Frederick Douglass High School remembered Brianna as a bright, determined student who maintained a B average despite the challenges of her environment and family responsibilities. Mrs. Teresa Coleman, Brianna's 11th grade English teacher, kept a poem Brianna had written about her dreams of becoming a nurse, describing it as full of the kind of hope that breaks your heart when you know the obstacles these kids face. Though she had been accepted to the nursing program at Coppin State University with a partial scholarship, Brianna's education was interrupted when she became pregnant with her first child at 19, a common story in a city where opportunity and resources for young people were often scarce. Rather than giving up on her dreams, however, friends say Brianna simply adjusted her timeline, telling them, "My babies will just have to come with me to my college graduation someday." The 3 children who witnessed their mother's murder, Darnell, age 8, Kiara, age 6, and Marcus Jr., age 4, were described by neighbors as well-behaved and clearly adored by their mother, despite the challenging circumstances of their upbringing. Brianna had separated from Marcus Johnson Sr., the father of her 2 younger children, approximately 2 years before her death, after a relationship marked by financial strain and occasional domestic disputes. Darnell's father had never been consistently involved in his life, leaving Brianna as the sole provider and caregiver for all 3 children. Despite working 2 jobs, daytime hours at Bright Futures Daycare Center and evening shifts 3 times a week at Mercy Medical Center, friends say Brianna always made time to help her children with homework, cook proper meals, and even volunteer occasionally at their school. She was the kind of mother who would work a 12-hour day and still come home and read bedtime stories with different voices for each character, said LaTonya Williams, Brianna's closest friend and fellow daycare worker. The modest 2-bedroom row house where the family lived had been purchased by Brianna just 18 months before her death through a first-time homebuyer program aimed at stabilizing Baltimore neighborhoods. Though the mortgage payments stretched her budget to the limit, Brianna had told friends that giving her children the security of their own home was worth the financial sacrifice. Photos recovered from Brianna's social media accounts show a home filled with children's artwork, family photos, and hand-painted furniture, evidence of a mother creating a nurturing environment with limited resources. Brianna's supervisor at Mercy Medical Center, nursing director Helen Kramer, described her as the kind of employee who never called out sick, who would pick up extra shifts when others couldn't work, and who treated every patient with the same care she would give her own family. Her personnel file contained multiple commendations from patients who had specifically mentioned her compassionate care and reassuring presence during their hospital stays. Colleagues recalled how Brianna would often bring homemade cookies or brownies to share during break times, despite the fact that everyone knew her budget was tight. They also noted that she never complained about her circumstances, instead focusing on her plans to eventually complete her nursing degree, once her children were all in school full-time. In the neighborhood around Eager Street where the Mitchells lived, Brianna was known for keeping an eye on elderly neighbors, sometimes bringing them plates of food or picking up prescriptions when she did her own shopping. Mrs. Edith Townsend, an 84-year-old who lived 2 doors down from the Mitchell home, broke down in tears when interviewed by detectives, saying, "That girl would call me every day after her evening shift just to make sure I was okay and didn't need anything. Who's going to check on me now?" This sentiment was echoed by several neighbors who described a woman who somehow found time for small kindnesses, despite her exhausting schedule and responsibilities. The evening of her murder had been, by all accounts, an ordinary one in Brianna's busy life. Attendance records from Bright Futures Daycare showed she had worked her regular 8-hour shift, leaving at 3:30 to pick up her children from their after-school program. A receipt recovered from her purse indicated she had stopped at the Save-A-Lot grocery store on her way home from her evening shift at the hospital, purchasing ingredients for the children's school lunches the next day, along with pancake mix for their traditional Sunday morning breakfast. Her final text message, sent to her sister in Atlanta at 9:47 p.m., read, "Just finishing up at work, gonna stop for milk and head home. Call you this weekend about Thanksgiving plans." What Brianna could not have known as she sent that text was that 2 teenagers had already broken into her home and were holding her children captive, waiting for her return. Security footage from the hospital parking lot shows her walking to her car at 9:52 p.m., stopping to chat briefly with a coworker before driving away. The drive from Mercy Medical Center to her home typically took about 15 minutes, and neighbors' security cameras captured her car parking on Eager Street at 10:11 p.m. The final moments of Brianna Mitchell's life were spent carrying grocery bags and her nursing scrubs up the steps to her front door, likely looking forward to checking on her children and getting some rest before another early morning. In the days following the murder, a makeshift memorial grew outside the Mitchell home, with stuffed animals, candles, flowers, and handwritten notes covering the front steps and spilling onto the sidewalk. Many of the notes came from parents whose children had been cared for by Brianna at the daycare center, describing the positive impact she had made on their families. Others came from hospital patients who remembered her kindness during their most vulnerable moments. Perhaps most poignantly, children from the neighborhood had drawn pictures and written messages to Darnell, Kiara, and Marcus Jr., promising to be their friends and help them through this difficult time. A community fundraiser organized by Brianna's coworkers at both the hospital and daycare raised over $60,000 in just 3 days, money that would be placed in a trust for the children's future education and care. Deborah Mitchell, Brianna's mother, who would take custody of the 3 children despite her own health problems and limited income, told reporters through tears, "My daughter lived for those babies. Everything she did, every extra shift, every coupon she clipped, was to give them a better life than she had. The best way to honor her is to make sure they still get that chance." As detectives worked to solve the case, they found themselves unusually invested in finding justice for a victim who, by all accounts, had been the best of what Baltimore could produce, a young woman who faced significant challenges but responded with grace, determination, and an unfailing commitment to creating a better future for her children. In a city where some homicides received only cursory investigation due to limited resources and overwhelming caseloads, the murder of Brianna Mitchell became a priority, not just because of its brutality, but because of who she had been in life. The 911 call that alerted authorities to Brianna Mitchell's murder came in at 10:32 p.m., recorded in the Baltimore City Emergency Response System, with the dispatcher's notes indicating child caller reporting mother shot, suspects fled scene. The recording captured the remarkable composure of 8-year-old Darnell Mitchell as he provided his address and explained that bad boys had hurt his mother, a composure that would later be described by child psychologists as a manifestation of severe shock. Dispatcher Tamika Johnson kept the boy on the line while units were dispatched, gently encouraging him to check if doors were locked and to gather his siblings in one place, all while knowing that the child was likely looking at his mother's body during the conversation. The first responders arrived at 10:39 p.m., with Officer Regina Collins and her partner, Officer James Rodriguez, approaching the house with weapons drawn, uncertain if the perpetrators might still be present, despite the child's assurance they had left. What the officers encountered upon entering the Mitchell home was a scene that would haunt even these experienced officers from Baltimore's Eastern District, an area unfortunately familiar with violent crime. Brianna Mitchell's body lay in the center of the living room in a large pool of blood, with evident gunshot wounds to her torso, limbs, and head. Her 3 children were huddled around her, their pajamas and hands covered in their mother's blood from their attempts to help her. Officer Collins would later testify that the 6-year-old girl, Kiara, had been singing a lullaby to her mother, stopping only to look up at the officers and ask, "Can you fix her now?" Officer Rodriguez immediately secured the scene, while Collins gently led the children to the kitchen, away from their mother's body, where she began the delicate process of gathering preliminary information while waiting for additional units to arrive. Detective Harold Jenkins, a 22-year veteran of the Baltimore Police Department's Homicide Unit, was assigned as lead investigator and arrived at the scene at 11:15 p.m. Jenkins, known within the department for his methodical approach and high clearance rate, particularly in cases involving family victims, immediately recognized the psychological complexity of a case with 3 traumatized child witnesses. Rather than attempting to interview the children at the scene, Jenkins arranged for them to be transported to Johns Hopkins Hospital, where they could receive medical attention for shock, while specialized child forensic interviewers could be brought in. He also made the crucial decision to have the children's clothing collected as evidence before they were bathed, correctly anticipating that transfer evidence from the perpetrators might be present, given the children's proximity to the crime. The crime scene processing began in earnest with the arrival of the Mobile Crime Lab at 11:27 p.m., bringing specialized technicians and equipment to document and collect evidence from what was already being classified as a high-priority homicide. Lead crime scene technician Gabriela Santos directed her team to work from the perimeter inward, documenting the point of entry, a rear window with a broken lock, before proceeding through each room of the house. Digital photographs and video recordings captured the scene from multiple angles, with particular attention paid to blood spatter patterns that would later help reconstruct the sequence of events. 7 shell casings from a 9mm handgun were recovered from the living room floor, along with 2 distinct sets of bloody shoe prints leading from the victim toward the front door. The meticulous process of evidence collection continued throughout the night, with technicians using alternate light sources to detect bodily fluids not visible to the naked eye, and electrostatically lifting dust impressions from surfaces where the perpetrators might have touched or leaned. Of particular importance was a partial handprint found on the wall near the front door, which appeared to have been left when one of the perpetrators steadied himself while potentially looking out the window before departing. Fibers caught on the splintered frame of the rear entry window were carefully collected, as were cigarette butts found in the backyard that might indicate the perpetrators had watched the house before breaking in. Every door handle, light switch, and potential contact surface was dusted for fingerprints, yielding several clear impressions that would later prove crucial to the investigation. While the crime scene was being processed, other detectives canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors despite the late hour in hopes of finding witnesses who might have seen or heard something relevant to the investigation. This canvass initially yielded limited results, with most neighbors reporting that they had heard what they thought were fireworks or car backfires around the time of the shooting, but had not looked outside. However, one elderly resident 3 houses down, Mr. Clarence Wilson, mentioned that he had been walking his dog shortly before 10 p.m. and had noticed 2 young men wearing dark hoodies acting shifty near the alley behind the Mitchell home. Though he couldn't provide detailed descriptions due to poor lighting and his failing eyesight, this information gave investigators a time frame for the suspect's arrival in the neighborhood. By dawn, the most significant breakthrough came from a security camera mounted on a convenience store 2 blocks from the Mitchell home. Detective Aisha Johnson, who had been assigned to locate and review all surveillance footage in the area, discovered that the store's exterior camera had captured 2 young males walking in the direction of Eager Street at approximately 9:30 p.m. Though the footage was somewhat grainy, it clearly showed 2 teenagers, one wearing a distinctive red and black hoodie with an athletic logo on the back, and the other in a dark blue hoodie with white drawstrings. Both appeared to be wearing bandanas around their necks, which would later match the children's description of how the killers had partially covered their faces during the attack. At Johns Hopkins Hospital, specialized forensic interviewers from the Child Advocacy Center began the delicate process of speaking with the Mitchell children at 8 a.m. the following morning, after they had received medical attention and a few hours of sedated sleep. Dr. Rachel Goldman, a forensic psychologist with extensive experience interviewing child witnesses to violent crime, conducted separate sessions with each child, recording the interviews for later use as evidence. 8-year-old Darnell provided the most detailed account, describing how the two teenagers had broken into the house while the children were watching a cartoon show, and how they had played on their phones while waiting for his mother to come home. With remarkable recall, he described one perpetrator as having twisty hair that was yellow at the tips, and the other as having a scar above his eye like Harry Potter. Perhaps most chillingly, Darnell recounted how the teens had instructed the children to watch carefully as they shot his mother, telling them, "This is what happens when you don't respect the game." 6-year-old Kiara's interview corroborated her brother's account, though with less detail, adding the observation that one of the teens had been wearing shoes like the ones all the basketball boys wear, with the swoosh thing on them. 4-year-old Marcus Jr. was unable to provide much coherent information, but became extremely agitated when shown a picture of a handgun similar to the one used in the crime, indicating he recognized the object and associated it with fear. Dr. Goldman noted in her report that all 3 children exhibited signs of severe trauma that would require extensive therapeutic intervention, and that their accounts suggested the murder had elements of a deliberate, almost ritualistic demonstration rather than a typical felony homicide. As the first day of investigation progressed, the medical examiner's preliminary report provided crucial insights into the calculated nature of the attack. Dr. Victor Reyes documented 7 gunshot wounds on Brianna Mitchell's body, noting that the first 5 shots had been deliberately placed in non-immediately fatal locations, the shoulders, thighs, and abdomen, consistent with an intent to prolong suffering rather than kill quickly. The 6th shot had struck her chest, likely causing fatal damage to her heart, while the final shot to her temple appeared to have been delivered execution style after she was already incapacitated. Based on stippling patterns and bullet trajectories, Dr. Reyes estimated that the shooters had stood approximately 4 to 5 feet from the victim, taking turns firing at her while she was kneeling on the floor. By late afternoon of the first day, Detective Jenkins had assembled his investigative team in the Eastern District headquarters to organize the evidence and establish investigative priorities. The ballistics report indicated that all 7 shell casings came from the same weapon, a 9mm semi-automatic pistol, though the unusual firing pattern suggested the gun had been passed between 2 shooters. Cell phone records for Brianna Mitchell's phone showed no unusual calls or messages in the days leading up to her murder, supporting the growing theory that she had been a random rather than targeted victim. However, the methodical nature of the crime, particularly the decision to force the children to watch, suggested motivations more complex than a typical robbery or home invasion. The most promising lead came when Detective Johnson compiled all surveillance footage from a 6-block radius and created a timeline of the suspect's movements. The same 2 individuals captured near the convenience store appeared on cameras at a gas station, a check-cashing store, and an apartment building, allowing investigators to track their approach to and departure from the Mitchell neighborhood. Though their faces were partially obscured in all footage, their distinctive clothing and physical builds remained consistent. Most significantly, footage from a bank ATM captured at 11:04 p.m., approximately 30 minutes after the murder, showed the same 2 individuals walking rapidly away from the direction of Eager Street, with one clearly counting what appeared to be cash, presumably taken from the Mitchell home. By the end of the first 48 hours, Investigators had compiled physical evidence, including fingerprints, shoe prints, DNA samples from cigarette butts, and possible touch DNA from surfaces in the house, ballistics information, and surveillance footage, along with witness statements from the children and neighbors. They had also begun the process of canvassing local schools with still images from the surveillance footage, hoping that teachers or school resource officers might recognize the distinctive clothing or physical characteristics of the perpetrators. The investigation was progressing rapidly by Baltimore standards, driven by both the heinous nature of the crime and the unusual amount of evidence available, but detectives were acutely aware that identifying the perpetrators was only the first step in building a case that could withstand the scrutiny of the criminal justice system and deliver justice for Brianna Mitchell and her traumatized children. On the third day of the investigation, a crucial breakthrough came when Detective Jenkins received a call from Officer Darren Wilson, a school resource officer at Patterson High School in East Baltimore. Officer Wilson had been shown the surveillance images as part of the department-wide effort to identify the teens captured near the crime scene. After reviewing the footage several times, Wilson expressed confidence that he recognized one of the suspects as 16-year-old Ethan Wilson, a sophomore with a history of disciplinary problems, but no prior arrests. Officer Wilson explained that he immediately recognized Ethan's distinctive red and black hoodie with the Baltimore Ravens logo, as he had confiscated it from the teen just 2 weeks earlier due to a dress code violation before returning it after school. More significantly, Wilson stated he could identify Ethan by his unusual gait, a slight swing of his right shoulder when walking that coaches had tried to correct during his brief time on the school's basketball team. Acting on this identification, detectives obtained Ethan Wilson's school records and the address, learning that he lived with his grandmother approximately 15 blocks from the Mitchell home. Rather than making an immediate arrest, Detective Jenkins opted for surveillance, assigning plainclothes officers to monitor the Wilson residence while gathering additional evidence to support a search warrant. School attendance records showed that Ethan had been absent on both the day of the murder and the following day, supposedly due to illness, according to a call from his grandmother. Social media analysts within the department began combing through public posts associated with Ethan's known accounts, discovering several concerning images posted in the months leading up to the murder, including photos of him posing with what appeared to be a handgun and making gang-affiliated hand gestures. Perhaps most significantly, analysts found a recent connection between Ethan Wilson and another Patterson High student, 17-year-old Malik Thompson, who appeared in several photos with Ethan and matched the general description of the second suspect from the surveillance footage. Malik's social media presence was more limited, but what was visible showed similar concerning content, including rap lyrics he had written that glorified violence against disrespectful women. School records indicated that Malik had also been absent on the same days as Ethan, and his listed address placed him in the same general neighborhood, approximately 6 blocks from Ethan's home. Detective Aisha Johnson took the lead on investigating Malik Thompson, discovering that, unlike Ethan, Malik did have a juvenile record, with 2 arrests for shoplifting and 1 for simple assault following a fight at a community basketball court when he was 14. All cases had been diverted to youth intervention programs rather than resulting in formal adjudication. Interviews with Malik's former probation officer revealed a troubled home life with an absent father and a mother struggling with addiction issues, leading to Malik primarily residing with an aunt who worked night shifts and was rarely home during evening hours. The probation officer described Malik as a follower looking for belonging, who had shown improvement during structured programming, but quickly reverted to problematic behavior when left to his own devices. With 2 potential suspects identified, Investigators needed to strengthen the connection between these teenagers and the crime scene before making arrests. A crucial piece of evidence emerged when crime lab technicians completed analysis of the partial fingerprint found on the wall near the Mitchell home's front door, determining it was a match for Malik Thompson's right index finger based on prints on file from his previous arrests. Additionally, analysts reviewing all available surveillance footage discovered a clear frame showing a distinctive scar above the eyebrow of one suspect, consistent with both the child witness's Harry Potter description and a scar visible in Malik's school yearbook photo from the previous year. To further build their case, detectives obtained cell phone records for numbers associated with both teens through emergency court orders. The data revealed that both phones had connected to cell towers covering the area around the Mitchell home during the time frame of the murder, directly contradicting the alibi Ethan's grandmother had provided that he had been home sick all evening. Text messages exchanged between the two phones in the hours before the murder included cryptic references to making a move tonight and becoming legends, though nothing explicitly stating their intentions to commit a homicide. Perhaps most incriminating location data showed both phones traveling together throughout the evening, following a path that aligned perfectly with the suspects captured on various surveillance cameras. 5 days after Brianna Mitchell's murder, detectives felt they had gathered sufficient evidence to justify search warrants for both teenagers' residences and arrest warrants for both Ethan Wilson and Malik Thompson. Judge Raymond Harris reviewed the evidence package presented by prosecutors and authorized the warrants, agreeing that the combination of eyewitness descriptions, surveillance footage, fingerprint evidence, and cell phone data constituted probable cause. The judge also granted a request for no-knock warrants based on the violent nature of the crime and the possibility that the murder weapon might still be in the suspect's possession. In the early morning hours of November 2nd, tactical teams simultaneously executed the search warrants at both residences, taking Ethan Wilson and Malik Thompson into custody without incident. At Ethan's grandmother's home, officers located the distinctive red and black Ravens hoodie hidden in a crawlspace above his closet, along with a pair of Nike basketball shoes with tread patterns consistent with one set of bloody footprints found at the crime scene. When examined under specialized lighting, both items showed traces of blood not visible to the naked eye. At Malik Thompson's aunt's apartment, officers recovered the blue hoodie with white drawstrings seen in the surveillance footage, also showing trace evidence of blood spatter. Perhaps most damning, a shoebox in Malik's closet contained a 9mm handgun wrapped in a bandana, which ballistics would later confirm was the murder weapon used to kill Brianna Mitchell. When taken into custody, the two teenagers displayed markedly different reactions. Ethan Wilson immediately requested a lawyer and refused to speak with investigators, maintaining a stone-faced expression throughout the booking process. In contrast, Malik Thompson initially attempted to establish an alibi, claiming he had been at his aunt's apartment all evening watching movies with Ethan. When confronted with the cell phone evidence contradicting this claim, Malik became agitated, alternating between angry outbursts and tearful denials of involvement. Though formal questioning was terminated once he eventually requested an attorney, Malik made a spontaneous statement to the transporting officer that would later prove significant. "You don't understand, we didn't pick her special or nothing. It was just supposed to be a joke that got out of hand." As news of the arrests spread, the community reaction was a mixture of relief and shock. While many had assumed the perpetrators would be older individuals with extensive criminal histories, the revelation that two local high school students were responsible for such a brutal crime created a new wave of concern about youth violence in the city. Media outlets quickly discovered and published sanitized versions of the teens' social media posts, drawing connections between their apparent glorification of violence and the actual brutality they were now accused of committing. Parents of other Patterson High students expressed disbelief, with many reporting that while neither teen had been particularly popular or academically successful, neither had displayed the kind of obvious warning signs that might have predicted such extreme violence. School officials at Patterson High held emergency meetings with students and parents, bringing in counselors to help the school community process the arrests of two of their own for such a shocking crime. Several teachers came forward with observations about both teens, noting that while Ethan had been generally disruptive and academically disengaged, Malik had shown occasional promise and creativity in his writing assignments, though often focused on dark themes. The school's basketball coach recalled that Ethan had been cut from the team the previous year due to poor attendance at practices, after which his attitude toward school had deteriorated further. A language arts teacher shared that Malik had written a poem earlier in the semester about becoming someone people remember, which now took on disturbing new significance in light of the crimes he was accused of committing. As the investigation continued to develop, detectives executed additional search warrants for the teen's social media accounts and cell phones, uncovering private messages that shed light on possible motivations for the seemingly senseless crime. In a series of exchanges in the weeks leading up to the murder, Ethan and Malik had discussed their frustration with feeling invisible and disrespected in their community and at school. They had apparently been influenced by social media posts from older gang members who gained status through acts of violence, with one message from Ethan stating, "Nobody notices regular expletive. You gotta do something crazy to get respect." This evolving picture of two teenagers desperate for recognition and status began to provide context for why they might have targeted a random mother and forced her children to watch her murder, not out of any personal grievance, but as a misguided attempt to establish a reputation for extreme violence that would earn them the fear and respect they craved. With both suspects in custody, the focus of the investigation shifted to building an airtight case that would withstand the scrutiny of the criminal justice system and the inevitable defense challenges to come. Assistant State's Attorney Eleanor Parker was assigned as lead prosecutor, bringing her 15 years of experience with violent crime cases and particular expertise in prosecuting homicides with juvenile offenders. Parker immediately recognized both the strengths and potential vulnerabilities of the case, organizing a comprehensive strategy meeting with Detective Jenkins and the forensic team to identify any evidentiary gaps that needed to be addressed before formal charges were filed. While the evidence connecting the teens to the scene was substantial, Parker emphasized the need to establish not just their presence, but their specific actions during the crime, particularly given the possibility that defense attorneys might attempt to argue that one teen was merely present while the other committed the actual murder. Forensic analysis of the recovered 9mm handgun provided crucial evidence of both teens' direct participation in the killing. The weapon, a Glock 19 with the serial number partially filed off, had been processed for fingerprints and DNA, yielding partial prints from both Ethan Wilson and Malik Thompson on the grip, magazine, and slide. Ballistics confirmed that all 7 shell casings recovered from the Mitchell home had been fired from this weapon, and residue tests on both teens' clothing indicated that each had recently fired a gun. Most significantly, DNA analysis of blood spatter on both the red and black hoodie and the blue hoodie confirmed it was Brianna Mitchell's blood, with the spatter patterns consistent with standing within a few feet of the victim during the shooting. The footprint evidence proved equally damning when forensic technicians compared the bloody prints from the crime scene with the shoes recovered from the teens' homes. The Nike basketball shoes found in Ethan's closet created an identical tread pattern to one set of prints, while a pair of Adidas high tops recovered from Malik's room matched the second set. Microscopic analysis revealed that both pairs of shoes contained blood in the tread grooves that matched Brianna Mitchell's DNA profile, placing both teenagers at the immediate crime scene, standing in the victim's blood. When these shoes were compared to surveillance footage showing the suspects approaching and leaving the area, the distinctive footwear was clearly visible, creating an unbroken chain of evidence, placing both teens at the scene wearing the shoes that had left bloody prints around Brianna Mitchell's body. Cell phone evidence provided perhaps the most comprehensive timeline of the teens' activities before, during, and after the murder. Digital forensic specialists obtained court orders to access all data from the phones recovered during the searches of both residences, revealing not just location information, but also text messages, photos, and search histories that painted a disturbing picture of premeditation. In the week before the murder, searches on Malik's phone included queries for how to break into houses quietly, best way to make someone suffer, and how to scare someone for life. Ethan's phone contained similar searches along with browsing history, showing he had viewed multiple websites describing famous murder cases and how to get away with murder articles. Perhaps most disturbing were photos, recovered from both phones, taken inside the Mitchell home during the commission of the crime. These images, apparently taken to document and later boast about their actions, showed Brianna Mitchell kneeling on the floor with the terrified children visible in the background. Metadata from the photos confirmed they were taken between 10:15 p.m. and 10:25 p.m. on the night of the murder, directly placing both teens at the scene during the time frame established by the medical examiner. One particularly incriminating video, only 7 seconds long, captured Malik telling the children, "Remember this face," while Ethan could be heard laughing in the background. This footage not only corroborated the children's accounts, but also established both teens' willing participation in terrorizing the family. Text messages exchanged between Ethan and Malik in the hours after the murder revealed their reactions to their own actions. At 11:43 p.m., approximately an hour after killing Brianna Mitchell, Ethan texted Malik, "We legendary now. Nobody gonna step to us after they hear about this." Malik's response came 3 minutes later. "That little boy's face, though, he gonna remember us forever. We owned them." These messages, coupled with social media posts they had made in the weeks leading up to the crime about wanting to do something that puts us on the map, established a motive centered around gaining notoriety and respect through extreme violence, a motive that would later factor heavily into the prosecution's case for first-degree murder with special circumstances. Additional evidence emerged when detectives interviewed other students from Patterson High School who had associated with Ethan and Malik in the weeks before the murder. Several classmates reported hearing the pair discuss their frustration with feeling disrespected and their desire to do something crazy to change how people viewed them. One student, whose identity was protected due to safety concerns, revealed that Ethan had shown him the gun approximately 2 weeks before the murder, claiming he had purchased it from an older cousin for $300. Another student reported overhearing Malik say they were going to pick a random house and make an example to show everyone what happens when you don't give respect. While these statements initially seemed like typical teenage bravado to those who heard them, in retrospect, they provided clear evidence of the teens' intentions and planning. Financial evidence also played a role in building the case, as investigators traced the source of the weapon and established what had happened to the money stolen from Brianna Mitchell's home. Bank records showed that Ethan had made a cash deposit of $200 the day after the murder, money he could not account for from legitimate sources. A search of Malik's room had uncovered a shoebox containing $143 in small bills, consistent with the approximately $350 that Brianna's mother confirmed had been kept in the kitchen jar for emergencies. Interviews with the cousin who had allegedly sold the gun to Ethan confirmed the transaction, adding another charge of illegal transfer of a firearm to the growing list of offenses. As prosecutors built their case, they paid particular attention to evidence that would support charging the teens as adults despite their ages, focusing on elements showing premeditation, extreme cruelty, and lack of remorse. Maryland law allowed juveniles as young as 14 to be charged as adults for first-degree murder, but prosecutors anticipated defense challenges to this decision given the defendants' ages of 16 and 17. To support adult charges, they compiled evidence of sophisticated planning, including internet searches about police investigation techniques and methods to destroy evidence. They also documented the teens' attempts to establish alibis, with text messages showing they had coordinated their stories and instructed each other to delete certain communications after the crime was committed. The most compelling evidence for treating the case as an adult matter came from the recovered cell phone video showing the calculated psychological torture of forcing the children to watch their mother's murder. Forensic psychologists who reviewed this evidence concluded that the level of cruelty displayed indicated an advanced understanding of how to inflict maximum psychological damage, belying any claim that the teens did not comprehend the consequences of their actions due to immature development. The psychological evaluations of both teens, conducted after their arrests, further supported this assessment, with both displaying concerning traits including lack of empathy, callousness toward the suffering of others, and pride rather than remorse when discussing their alleged actions. Perhaps the most damning piece of evidence emerged almost by accident when digital forensic specialists discovered that Malik's phone had continued recording audio for nearly 3 minutes after the video ended, apparently because he had failed to properly stop the recording. This audio captured the teens discussing the shooting as it happened, with voices clearly identifiable as Ethan saying, "Your turn, finish her," followed by the sound of the final gunshot. The recording continued as they left the house, capturing Malik saying, "That was better than I thought it would be," and Ethan responding, "Did you see how scared those kids were? Nobody's ever going to forget us now." This unintentional recording, which the teens had apparently failed to delete because they were unaware of its existence, provided irrefutable evidence of both their direct participation in the murder and their disturbing motivation and lack of remorse. By the time formal charges were filed 10 days after the murder, prosecutors had assembled a case built on multiple independent lines of evidence: physical evidence from the crime scene, including fingerprints, footprints, and DNA; digital evidence from surveillance footage, cell phone locations, text messages, photos, and the inadvertent audio recording; eyewitness testimony from the 3 children who had witnessed the crime; financial evidence tracing the stolen money; and psychological evaluations indicating both capacity to stand trial as adults and the extreme callousness that would support the maximum possible penalties. The case against Ethan Wilson and Malik Thompson was not merely strong, it was overwhelming, providing prosecutors with confidence as they prepared to seek justice for Brianna Mitchell and her traumatized children. The coordinated arrests of Ethan Wilson and Malik Thompson took place at 4:30 a.m. on November 2nd, a deliberate time chosen to maximize the element of surprise and minimize the risk of evidence destruction or attempted flight. Baltimore police tactical teams, equipped with ballistic shields and no-knock warrants, simultaneously breached the front doors of both suspects' residences. At Ethan Wilson's grandmother's home on North Montford Avenue, officers found the 16-year-old asleep in his bedroom, surrounded by typical teenage possessions, alongside the incriminating evidence that would later link him to Brianna Mitchell's murder. Body camera footage from the arresting officers showed Ethan initially disoriented and confused, quickly shifting to a mask of stoic indifference as he was handcuffed and informed of his rights. His grandmother, 67-year-old Margaret Wilson, emerged from her bedroom in a nightgown, visibly distressed and repeatedly asking officers what her grandson had done to warrant such a dramatic arrest. The scene at Malik Thompson's aunt's apartment on East Fayette Street unfolded somewhat differently, with the 17-year-old already awake and playing video games despite the early hour when officers breached the door. Body camera footage captured his immediate reaction, a momentary expression of shock quickly replaced by what one officer would later describe as a smirk, like he'd been expecting us and was almost relieved the waiting was over. Malik's aunt was not home at the time of the arrest, having left for her overnight shift at a local hospital, leaving the teen alone in the apartment where officers would discover the murder weapon hidden in his closet. Unlike Ethan, Malik was immediately talkative during his arrest, asking officers, "How did you find me?" and "Was it the shoes that gave us away?" Questions that revealed both consciousness of guilt and an awareness of potential evidence against him. The two teenagers were transported separately to the Baltimore Police Department's homicide unit, where specially prepared interrogation rooms awaited them. Following standard protocol for juvenile suspects, notifications were made to parents or guardians and to the Office of the Public Defender. Margaret Wilson arrived at the police station within an hour of her grandson's arrest, distraught and insisting there must be a mistake, telling detectives that Ethan was a good boy who sometimes runs with the wrong crowd but would never hurt anyone. When informed of the charges being considered, first-degree murder with special circumstances, she collapsed into a chair, repeatedly whispering, "Not my boy, not my Ethan." No family members appeared for Malik Thompson during the initial processing period, with his aunt unreachable at work, and his mother's whereabouts unknown to authorities at that time. Detective Harold Jenkins led the interrogation team for Ethan Wilson, bringing his experience with juvenile offenders and his calm, methodical approach to the interview room. The interrogation, recorded on both video and audio, as required by Maryland law, began at 7:15 a.m., after Ethan had been provided with water, a bathroom break, and a clear explanation of his Miranda rights. Present in the room were Detective Jenkins, a second detective serving as witness, and a youth advocate from the Department of Juvenile Services as required when questioning minors about serious offenses. Ethan's grandmother had declined to be present, stating she was too upset to face her grandson, while the public defender assigned to the case had not yet arrived at the station. The initial phase of Ethan's interrogation yielded little information, as the teen maintained rigid control over his facial expressions and body language, while repeating the phrase, "I want a lawyer," to every question. Detective Jenkins, recognizing that formal questioning could not continue once counsel had been requested, nevertheless remained in the room, making occasional conversational remarks about the evidence they had already gathered. This technique, while not producing any admissible statements, allowed investigators to observe Ethan's nonverbal reactions when certain details of the case were mentioned. Most notably, when Jenkins casually mentioned the recovery of photos from cell phones at the scene, Ethan's composed facade briefly cracked, with visible alarm crossing his face before he regained control and again requested an attorney. At this point, the interview was formally terminated, and Ethan was returned to a holding cell to await his attorney's arrival. Malik Thompson's interrogation, conducted by Detective Aisha Johnson in a separate room, took a dramatically different path. Initially confident and even somewhat boastful, Malik waived his right to have an attorney present, telling detectives, "I've got nothing to hide. You can ask me whatever you want." This bravado quickly dissolved when Detective Johnson methodically laid out the evidence already in police possession. The fingerprint matching his on the wall of the Mitchell home, his shoes matching bloody prints at the scene, surveillance footage tracking his movements, and cell phone data placing him at the exact location during the time frame of the murder. As these facts accumulated, Malik's demeanor shifted from confidence to obvious anxiety, with perspiration visible on his forehead and his leg bouncing rapidly under the table. When Detective Johnson placed photographs of Brianna Mitchell's children on the table, asking Malik if he recognized them, the teen's composure fully collapsed. He pushed the photos away, refusing to look at them, and began creating an elaborate alibi, claiming that he had been with Ethan that night, but had remained outside the house while his friend went in alone. "I didn't know what he was going to do in there," Malik insisted, his voice rising in pitch. "I thought we were just going to take some stuff, maybe scare them a little. I never touched that gun, never went inside." When confronted with the fingerprint evidence and the bloody footprints matching his shoes, Malik modified his story, now claiming he had entered the house but had tried to stop Ethan from shooting the woman. The turning point in Malik's interrogation came when Detective Johnson played a short clip of the audio accidentally recorded on his own phone, capturing his voice saying, "That was better than I thought it would be," after the murder. The teen's face drained of color as he heard his own words, and he sat in stunned silence for nearly a full minute, before whispering, "I want a lawyer now." Before the recording could be stopped, however, Malik made one final spontaneous statement. "We weren't trying to kill her at first, it just got out of control. We wanted them to be scared of us, to remember us. Nobody at school even knew our names before." Following the termination of both interrogations, detectives continued processing physical evidence while awaiting the arrival of defense attorneys. Blood samples were collected from both teens to compare against any unknown DNA found at the crime scene, and detailed photographs were taken of their hands, arms, and clothing to document any injuries or evidence of blood spatter that might have remained despite their attempts to clean themselves after the murder. A small scratch on Ethan's right forearm was noted and swabbed for DNA testing, with investigators theorizing it might have occurred during the break-in through the window at the Mitchell home. As news of the arrests spread throughout Baltimore, crowds began gathering outside the police station, with community members demanding justice for Brianna Mitchell and her children. Local news crews captured footage of Margaret Wilson being escorted to her car by officers, her face covered with a coat to shield her from cameras and the angry shouts of onlookers. In contrast, when word spread that no family members had appeared to support Malik Thompson, a palpable shift in the crowd's energy occurred, with some expressing a complex mixture of contempt for his actions, but also recognition of how a child so thoroughly abandoned by family systems might have become capable of such violence. By midday, attorneys from the public defender's office had arrived to represent both teens, immediately filing motions to suppress any statements made during interrogation and requesting that their clients be processed through the juvenile justice system rather than charged as adults. These legal maneuvers, though standard practice, sparked outrage in the community and among Brianna Mitchell's family members, who had gathered at her mother's home to support each other and the three traumatized children. Deborah Mitchell, speaking briefly to reporters outside her home, expressed the family's position clearly. They were old enough to plan this murder, old enough to laugh while doing it, and old enough to understand exactly what they were taking from those babies. They should be old enough to face adult consequences. Late that afternoon, both teenagers made their initial appearances before a judge via video link from the detention center where they had been transferred following processing. Judge Marcia Coleman reviewed the charges: first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, home invasion, armed robbery, and multiple counts of child endangerment and psychological child abuse, and denied bail for both defendants, citing the extremely violent nature of the crime and the risk to public safety. The judge also granted the prosecution's request for a forensic psychological evaluation of both teens to assess their competency to stand trial as adults, scheduling a transfer hearing for 2 weeks later to determine whether the case would remain in adult criminal court or be remanded to the juvenile system. As Ethan Wilson and Malik Thompson were led away to begin what would become a lengthy journey through the criminal justice system, detectives continued building their case, knowing that every piece of evidence would be scrutinized and challenged by defense attorneys determined to save their young clients from the possibility of spending the rest of their lives in prison. For the investigators who had worked tirelessly since receiving that first 911 call from a terrified 8-year-old boy, the arrests represented not the end of their work, but merely the transition to a new phase, ensuring that the case they had built would withstand every legal challenge and ultimately deliver justice for a mother whose life had been taken with calculated cruelty in front of her children's eyes. The Baltimore City Circuit Court building stood imposing against the gray February sky, its neoclassical columns and broad stone steps now crowded with protesters, journalists, and curious onlookers on the first day of what many were calling the Baltimore Orphan Case. 4 months had passed since the arrests of Ethan Wilson and Malik Thompson. Months filled with pre-trial motions, psychological evaluations, and heated public debate about trying juveniles as adults in cases of extreme violence. The decision to prosecute both teenagers in adult criminal court had been finalized 6 weeks earlier, when Judge Raymond Harris had ruled that the premeditated and extraordinarily cruel nature of the crime outweighed considerations of the defendants' ages. Now, as armed deputies established security perimeters around the courthouse, the city prepared for a trial that would force it to confront difficult questions about youth violence, accountability, and the limits of redemption. Inside Courtroom 3, with its polished oak benches and state seal mounted prominently behind the judge's bench, Assistant State's Attorney Eleanor Parker arranged her materials meticulously, reviewing her opening statement one final time. At 47, Parker had prosecuted over 100 homicide cases in her 15-year career with the Baltimore State's Attorney's Office, but she had confided to colleagues that this case affected her more deeply than most, perhaps because she herself was a mother of children close in age to the Mitchell siblings. Her normally understated appearance had been carefully considered for this day, with a conservative navy suit and minimal jewelry that would keep the focus on her words rather than her person as she addressed the jury for the first time. Across the aisle, defense attorneys Maria Rodriguez, representing Ethan Wilson, and James Washington, representing Malik Thompson, conferred in hushed tones, occasionally glancing toward the door through which their clients would soon enter. At precisely 9 a.m., Judge Sophia Chen entered the courtroom, her reputation for running efficient, no-nonsense proceedings immediately evident as she quickly addressed preliminary matters before ordering the defendants to be brought in. The atmosphere in the courtroom tensed perceptibly as Ethan Wilson and Malik Thompson were led in wearing dark suits that seemed to hang awkwardly on their teenage frames, the formal attire unable to disguise the fact that these accused murderers were still physically adolescents. Ethan's face remained impassive, as he had been throughout pre-trial hearings, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, deliberately avoiding contact with anyone in the courtroom. Malik, by contrast, scanned the gallery nervously, his gaze lingering momentarily on his aunt and mother seated in the back row, the first time his mother had appeared at any proceeding related to the case. The jury filing in represented a cross-section of Baltimore, 8 women and 4 men of various ages and racial backgrounds, selected through an exhaustive 2-week voir dire process that had eliminated potential jurors with strong preconceived notions about juvenile justice or capital punishment. Judge Chen addressed them directly, reiterating their responsibility to consider only the evidence presented in court and to set aside any information they might have encountered through media coverage. "You are not here to address broad social issues or to send messages," she reminded them firmly. "You are here to determine whether these specific defendants committed these specific acts as charged based solely on the evidence presented in this courtroom. With these instructions delivered, she nodded to Prosecutor Parker to begin her opening statement. Eleanor Parker approached the jury deliberately, making eye contact with each member before speaking in a clear, measured voice that filled the courtroom without seeming theatrical. On October 27th, Brianna Mitchell kissed her children goodbye and went to work, just as she did every day, expecting to return to them that evening, as she always had, she began, establishing immediately the ordinary nature of the day that would end in extraordinary violence. Using no notes, Parker walked the jury through Brianna's final day, her shift at the daycare center, her evening work at the hospital, the stop at the grocery store to buy food for her children's lunches the next day. With each detail, she humanized the victim, transforming her from a statistic into a mother whose absence left a permanent void in 3 young lives. The prosecutor's tone shifted subtly as she transitioned to describing what awaited Brianna when she returned home that night. The evidence will show that the defendants, Ethan Wilson and Malik Thompson, broke into Brianna Mitchell's home with a loaded 9mm handgun, not in a moment of impulsive teenage recklessness, but after days of planning, after internet searches about how to break into homes, after discussions about making themselves legendary through violence. Parker detailed how the teens had confined the 3 Mitchell children to the living room sofa, how they had waited patiently for Brianna to return, and how they had made the deliberate decision not just to kill her, but to force her children to watch as they took turns shooting her. Most powerfully, Parker addressed head-on the question that hung over the proceedings: the defendants' youth. The evidence will show that these defendants understood exactly what they were doing. Their actions were not impulsive but calculated, their motives were not confused but crystal clear, and their reaction afterward was not regret but satisfaction. She described the cell phone evidence that would be presented, the photos, the text messages, and most damningly, the accidental audio recording capturing the teens' reactions immediately after the murder. You will hear in their own voices their pride in having forced those children to watch their mother die. You will hear them discuss how nobody's ever going to forget us now. And when you have heard all the evidence, we are confident you will find both defendants guilty of murder in the first degree with special circumstances. Defense attorney Maria Rodriguez then rose to present opening statements for Ethan Wilson, her approach a stark contrast to the prosecution's emotional narrative. This case is about context, development, and proportionality, she began, her voice carrying the slight accent of her native Dominican Republic. Rodriguez acknowledged immediately that terrible things happened in that house on Eager Street, a tactical decision to avoid appearing to deny the obvious reality of Brianna Mitchell's death. Instead, she focused on Ethan's age and brain development, citing neuroscience research suggesting that the adolescent brain, particularly the parts responsible for impulse control and understanding long-term consequences, remains underdeveloped until the mid-20s. The evidence will show that Ethan Wilson had just turned 16 years old, 3 weeks before this tragedy. The evidence will show that he grew up in an environment where violence was normalized, where adult supervision was minimal, and where the influence of peers became the primary guiding force in his life. Rodriguez painted a picture of a child essentially raised by social media and street culture after his mother's death from cancer when he was 11 left him in the care of an elderly grandmother working multiple jobs to support them. This is not an excuse, she emphasized, but it is context that you must consider when evaluating his actions and determining appropriate accountability. Most controversially, Rodriguez suggested that while Ethan was present during the crime, the evidence would not conclusively prove that he fired the fatal shot that ultimately killed Brianna Mitchell. The prosecution wants you to view these 2 defendants as equally culpable, acting in perfect concert. but the evidence will show a more complex picture of influence, pressure, and varying levels of participation. This strategy immediately drew a sharp objection from the prosecution, arguing that it improperly suggested a factual dispute not supported by the evidence. Judge Chen sustained the objection, instructing Rodriguez to avoid making factual claims that would not be supported by evidence and reminding the jury that opening statements were not themselves evidence. James Washington, representing Malik Thompson, took a different approach in his opening statement, focusing on his client's troubled background and mental health issues that had gone undiagnosed and untreated throughout his childhood. The prosecution will show you text messages and social media posts and ask you to see a calculated killer. We will show you a child who has been failed by every system designed to protect him. Washington detailed Malik's history in the foster care system before being placed with his aunt at age 12, his mother's ongoing substance abuse issues, and school records indicating potential learning disabilities and behavioral problems that were identified but never addressed with appropriate interventions. Washington acknowledged more directly than Rodriguez that his client had participated in the crime, but framed that participation as the result of a perfect storm of developmental vulnerability, peer influence, and systemic failure. He promised to present expert testimony on adolescent brain development, the impact of trauma on decision-making, and the phenomenon of adolescent peer contagion, where teenagers in groups make decisions they would never make individually. This case is tragic for everyone involved, he concluded. A family has lost a mother, a community has lost a valued member, and 2 young lives hang in the balance. We ask only that you consider the full context before determining the appropriate outcome. As the opening statements concluded, Judge Chen called the first prosecution witness, Detective Harold Jenkins, who would establish the basic timeline of the investigation and introduce the jury to the crime scene through photographs and evidence recovered in the immediate aftermath of the murder. As Jenkins took the stand, Eleanor Parker displayed the first crime scene photo on the courtroom's evidence screens, an image of the Mitchell living room showing blood spatter on the walls and furniture, but tactfully avoiding any direct view of Brianna Mitchell's body at this early stage of the trial. The photo nevertheless elicited audible reactions from several jurors, with one woman briefly covering her mouth with her hand before regaining her composure. Detective Jenkins testified methodically about arriving at the scene, his first observations, and the process of securing evidence while simultaneously addressing the needs of 3 traumatized children found at the scene. His testimony, delivered in the matter-of-fact tone of a veteran homicide detective, nonetheless conveyed the emotional weight of the case when he described finding the children huddled around their mother's body. In my 22 years as a detective, I've never seen children that young attempting to provide first aid to a parent. The oldest boy had placed kitchen towels on some of the wounds, and the little girl was singing to her mother. This detail, not included in any media coverage of the case, visibly affected several jurors and caused Deborah Mitchell, seated in the front row of the gallery, to quietly weep. Through Detective Jenkins, the prosecution introduced the bloody footprints found at the scene, establishing through both testimony and photographic evidence that 2 distinct sets of prints had been identified and later matched to shoes owned by the defendants. Jenkins detailed how they had tracked the suspect's movements through surveillance cameras in the area, eventually identifying Ethan Wilson through his distinctive clothing and gait, recognized by a school resource officer. The detective explained how that initial identification had led investigators to Malik Thompson through social media connections, and ultimately to the evidence recovered during the simultaneous searches of both teenagers' residences. Defense attorneys cross-examined Jenkins aggressively on several points, particularly focusing on the chain of custody for evidence and whether confirmation bias might have influenced the investigation once the teens were identified as suspects. Rodriguez questioned Jenkins about whether other potential suspects had been adequately investigated, suggesting that the focus had narrowed too quickly on the two teenagers based on circumstantial evidence. Washington concentrated his cross-examination on the timeline, attempting to establish that the planning period had been shorter than the prosecution suggested, and that the crime might have been more impulsive than premeditated. As the first day of trial concluded, Judge Chen instructed the jury to avoid media coverage of the case and not to discuss the proceedings with anyone, scheduling testimony to resume the following morning with the medical examiner. The defendants were led out first, with Malik glancing back toward his mother, while Ethan maintained his stoic facade. Outside the courthouse, television cameras captured Brianna Mitchell's mother embracing her grandchildren, who had not attended the proceedings but had come to meet her afterward. The image of this grandmother, now raising three traumatized children while simultaneously seeking justice for her daughter, would appear on newspaper front pages across the country the next morning, visually encapsulating the human toll of a crime that had begun with two teenagers' desire for notoriety and ended with a family shattered by senseless violence. On the fifth day of the trial, the courtroom fell completely silent as 8-year-old Darnell Mitchell was led to the witness stand by a victim advocate from the state's attorney's office. Judge Chen had taken extraordinary measures to create a supportive environment for the child witness, including having the courtroom cleared of all spectators except immediate family members and essential court personnel. The judge had also granted the prosecution's motion to allow Darnell to testify via closed-circuit television if he became too distressed by the defendant's presence, but the boy had insisted on facing the teenagers directly, a decision that his grandmother and therapist had reluctantly supported after extensive preparation. Dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and khaki pants, Darnell appeared small in the witness chair, but sat with his shoulders square and his gaze steady, demonstrating a composure that belied his young age. Prosecutor Eleanor Parker approached the witness stand with a gentleness noticeably different from her typical courtroom demeanor, crouching slightly to be at eye level with the child. "Darnell, do you understand the difference between telling the truth and telling a lie?" she began, establishing the child's competency as a witness through standard questions about truth-telling that had been practiced during pretrial preparation. Darnell answered clearly and directly, explaining that telling the truth meant saying what really happened, even if it's scary or makes you sad. Judge Chen, satisfied with these responses, determined that the child understood the oath, and Darnell promised to tell the truth, with his hand raised just as he had seen adults do on television shows. With remarkable composure, Darnell recounted the events of October 27th, describing how he and his siblings had been watching cartoons when they heard a noise from the back of the house. "Two teenagers came in and told us to be quiet, or they would hurt us," he testified, identifying both Ethan Wilson and Malik Thompson by pointing to them at the defense table without hesitation. Darnell described how the teens had confined the children to the sofa, taking their mother's phone away when 6-year-old Kiara had tried to call for help. They kept checking the time and looking out the window. The one with the yellow tips in his hair, him, he pointed again to Malik, said they were waiting for someone special. When asked about what happened when his mother arrived home, Darnell's voice became softer but remained steady. Mom came in with groceries and dropped everything when she saw them. She kept saying, "Please don't hurt my babies," over and over. The child described how his mother had been forced to kneel in the middle of the living room floor directly in front of the sofa where the children sat. "They told us to watch carefully because this was important. They said we had to keep our eyes open or they would shoot us too." At this point, several jurors visibly struggled to maintain their composure, with one woman wiping tears away with the tissue the court officer had distributed earlier in anticipation of difficult testimony. Perhaps the most devastating moment of Darnell's testimony came when Prosecutor Parker gently asked him to describe what he remembered about the shooting itself. The child's clinical description, delivered in the straightforward manner of someone recounting steps in a familiar routine, was all the more powerful for its lack of emotional inflection. First they shot her in the shoulders, one side, then the other. Mom screamed really loud. Then they shot her legs, and she fell over, but was still alive. They were taking turns with the gun, passing it back and forth like a game. Darnell explained that the teenagers had laughed when his mother begged them to let her children leave the room, or at least close their eyes. The one in the red hoodie, him, he pointed to Ethan, said that was the whole point, that we had to see it all, so we would remember them forever. Defense attorneys faced the nearly impossible task of cross-examining a child witness about his mother's murder without appearing callous to the jury. Maria Rodriguez approached this challenge by focusing narrowly on Darnell's ability to observe and remember details accurately during such a traumatic event. "Darnell, I know this is hard, and I'm not going to ask you many questions," she began carefully. "When you say the teenagers were taking turns with the gun, are you absolutely certain you saw both of them fire it?" The child's response was immediate and unwavering. "Yes. They made a big deal about it, saying, 'Your turn, and now watch this.' They wanted us to know they were both doing it." James Washington, representing Malik Thompson, opted for a different approach, attempting to humanize his client by asking if either of the teenagers had shown any hesitation or reluctance during the events. "Did either of the boys seem scared? Or like maybe they didn't want to be there?" he asked. Darnell considered this question thoughtfully before answering. The one with the yellow hair tips seemed excited more than scared, but the other one got really quiet after the first couple of shots, like he was surprised by how much blood there was. This response, while perhaps intended to suggest Ethan's lesser enthusiasm for the violence, instead reinforced the prosecution's narrative that both teens had willingly participated while having ample opportunity to stop or leave. Following Darnell's testimony, Judge Chen called for an extended recess, recognizing the emotional toll on everyone in the courtroom. When proceedings resumed 2 hours later, the prosecution called Dr. Victor Reyes, the chief medical examiner who had performed the autopsy on Brianna Mitchell. With 30 years of forensic pathology experience, Dr. Reyes presented as the consummate professional, using clear, precise language to describe his findings while balancing technical accuracy with terms the jury could understand. After establishing his credentials and explaining the general purpose of an autopsy, Dr. Reyes displayed autopsy diagrams rather than actual photographs to illustrate the 7 gunshot wounds Brianna Mitchell had sustained. "The pattern and sequence of these wounds is significant," Dr. Reyes testified, pointing to the diagram. "The first 5 gunshot wounds, to both shoulders, both thighs, and the lower abdomen, were deliberately placed in areas that would cause significant pain and blood loss, but would not cause immediate death. These wounds would have been extremely painful and debilitating, but a person could remain conscious and aware for several minutes with these injuries." Using trajectory analysis and gunpowder residue patterns, Dr. Reyes explained that these shots had been fired from approximately 4 to 5 feet away, consistent with the scenario described by Darnell Mitchell. Most critically for the prosecution's theory of deliberate cruelty, Dr. Reyes testified that the sequence of shots indicated the killing had been intentionally prolonged. The 6th wound, to the chest, perforated the right ventricle of the heart and would have been fatal within 1 to 2 minutes. Based on blood evidence and wound characteristics, this shot came after the victim had already been suffering from the other wounds for some time. The final shot, he explained, had been delivered to the right temple at close range, likely after Brianna Mitchell was already incapacitated from the chest wound. This wound shows characteristics of a contact or near-contact wound, meaning the muzzle of the gun was pressed against or very near to the skin when fired. This would have caused instantaneous death. Under cross-examination, defense attorneys challenged Dr. Reyes on whether he could state with scientific certainty which defendant had fired which shots, a point he conceded he could not determine from the physical evidence alone. They also questioned whether his timeline could be precisely established, suggesting that the entire sequence might have happened more quickly than his testimony indicated. Dr. Reyes stood firm on his analysis of the wound patterns, stating, "The physical evidence from blood loss patterns, wound characteristics, and lividity development is consistent with a prolonged assault rather than a rapid sequence of shots." When asked directly if his findings were consistent with an impulsive, panic-driven shooting, Dr. Reyes replied definitively, "No. The wound pattern indicates deliberate targeting of non-immediately fatal areas before progressing to fatal shots. This is not consistent with panic or impulsivity." Following the medical testimony, the prosecution called digital forensics specialist Alicia Navarro, who would present what many considered the most damning evidence in the case: the contents of the defendant's cell phones. After establishing her credentials in digital evidence recovery and analysis, Navarro explained how she had extracted data from phones recovered during the searches of both defendants' homes, including deleted files that had been recovered through specialized software. The jury listened intently as she described the methodology used to verify that the phones belonged to the defendants and to establish the chain of custody for the digital evidence. Navarro began by presenting text messages exchanged between Ethan Wilson and Malik Thompson in the weeks leading up to the murder, displayed on courtroom screens with timestamps and phone identifiers clearly indicated. The messages revealed an escalating pattern of discussions about gaining respect and recognition through violence, with Ethan writing 3 weeks before the murder, "Nobody even knows who we are. We need to do something that makes everyone remember our names." Malik had responded, "For real, something legendary, something that gets on the news." Additional messages specifically discussed targeting a random home, with Malik writing, "It's better if we don't know them. More scary for everyone else when they realize it could happen to anybody." The most disturbing digital evidence came in the form of Internet search history from both defendants' phones. Navarro testified that in the 2 weeks before the murder, the teens had conducted searches including how to make someone suffer without killing them right away, best way to terrify someone, how to break into a house without leaving evidence, and famous murderers who became celebrities. These searches were interspersed with visits to websites describing famous murder cases and techniques used by police to solve homicides, suggesting both research into methods and attempts to learn how to avoid detection. Defense objections that these searches could have been for video games or creative writing assignments were undermined by the specificity of the queries and their timing in direct relation to the crime. The courtroom grew tense as Navarro prepared to present the photographic and audio evidence recovered from the phones. Judge Chen had previously ruled that while this evidence was admissible, certain images would be shown only to the jury via separate monitors to spare the Mitchell family from viewing them in open court. The photographs taken inside the Mitchell home during the crime showed Brianna kneeling on the floor with visible injuries, the terrified children on the sofa behind her, and the distinctive shoes of both defendants visible in some frames. Metadata embedded in the files confirmed they had been taken between 10:15 p.m. and 10:25 p.m. on October 27th, precisely during the time frame established by other evidence. The most powerful evidence presented by Navarro, however, was the 3-minute audio recording accidentally captured on Malik Thompson's phone after he apparently failed to properly stop a video recording. The courtroom fell completely silent as the recording began to play, starting with shuffling sounds and heavy breathing before Ethan's voice clearly said, "Your turn, finish her." The unmistakable sound of a gunshot followed, then Malik's voice saying, "Done," followed by laughter from both teens. As they apparently left the house, Malik could be heard saying, "That was better than I thought it would be," and Ethan responding, "Did you see how scared those kids were? Nobody's ever going to forget us now." The recording continued with the sounds of running footsteps and more laughter before eventually falling silent. The impact of this audio evidence on the courtroom was profound. Several jurors visibly recoiled at the casual callousness captured in the recording, while in the gallery, Deborah Mitchell buried her face in her hands. At the defense table, Malik Thompson slumped forward, staring at the floor, while Ethan Wilson maintained his now familiar blank expression. Eleanor Parker allowed the silence that followed the recording to linger for several moments before asking Navarro, "In your expert opinion, was this audio file edited or altered in any way?" Navarro's response was definitive, no. The file's metadata and internal characteristics are consistent with a continuous, unedited recording created on the defendant's phone at 10:28 p.m. on the night of the murder. Defense cross-examination of Navarro focused primarily on technical challenges to the digital evidence, questioning whether the phones could have been accessed by others or whether the timestamps could have been manipulated. Navarro methodically addressed each challenge, explaining the safeguards in digital forensics that allowed her to authenticate the evidence and confirm its provenance. When defense attorney Washington suggested that the audio recording might not clearly identify who had fired which shots, Navarro conceded this point, but noted that the recording definitively placed both defendants at the scene, actively participating in and commenting on the murder as it occurred. As the 8th day of trial concluded with Navarro's testimony, the prosecution had presented a comprehensive case built on multiple independent lines of evidence. The eyewitness testimony of a child who had watched his mother die, the medical evidence showing a deliberately prolonged, torturous killing, and the digital evidence capturing the defendant's planning, execution, and reactions to their own violence. The defense would begin presenting its case the following day, but legal observers noted the significant challenge they faced given the weight of evidence already before the jury and the emotional impact of testimony that had left even veteran courtroom personnel visibly affected. After 14 days of testimony, 97 exhibits of evidence, and 23 witnesses, the case of State of Maryland v. Wilson and Thompson was finally in the jury's hands. Judge Sophia Chen had delivered 4 hours of meticulous instructions to the 12 jurors and 4 alternates, explaining the legal standards they must apply to each of the charges: first-degree murder with special circumstances, conspiracy to commit murder, home invasion, armed robbery, and multiple counts of child endangerment and psychological child abuse. She had carefully defined the concepts of premeditation, transferred intent, aiding and abetting, and criminal responsibility, emphasizing that the jury must consider each defendant's culpability separately while applying the same legal standards to both. Most critically, she had instructed them on the prosecution's burden to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, while explaining that Maryland law permitted juveniles to be held fully accountable as adults for crimes of this nature if all elements were proven. The jury had departed for deliberations at 2:17 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon, leaving the courtroom in that peculiar limbo that always follows the conclusion of arguments in a high-profile case. Attorneys from both sides packed their materials while maintaining the professional poker faces developed over years of trial practice, neither side willing to reveal their private assessment of their chances. The defendants were returned to holding cells within the courthouse where they would remain during deliberations in case the jury returned quickly with questions or a verdict. In the hallway outside, reporters gathered around legal analysts offering predictions about the outcome, while on the courthouse steps, supporters of the Mitchell family maintained a quiet vigil, alongside a smaller group advocating for juvenile justice reform, who argued that no teenager, regardless of their crime, should face the possibility of execution or life imprisonment. Eleanor Parker retreated to the prosecution's war room on the third floor of the courthouse, where her team engaged in the ritual post-mortem of their case presentation. "We've presented everything we have as clearly and completely as possible," she told her co-counsel and paralegals. "The evidence is overwhelming, but we can never predict how a jury will respond when the defendants are so young." The defense teams similarly gathered in separate conference rooms, both sets of attorneys acknowledging privately that they had faced an uphill battle given the strength of the evidence, particularly the audio recording that had so powerfully captured their client's callousness after the murder. Their strategy discussions now centered primarily on preparing for the sentencing phase, anticipating that at least some of the charges would result in convictions. The Mitchell family gathered at Deborah Mitchell's home, where the three children had been living since their mother's murder. Having been shielded from most of the trial proceedings, the children spent the afternoon in typical activities, homework, video games, and therapy sessions, while their grandmother and extended family members anxiously awaited news from the courthouse. Local pastor Reverend James Washington, who had been providing spiritual support to the family throughout the ordeal, led them in prayer as evening approached with no word from the jury. "We ask not for vengeance, Lord," he prayed with them, "but for justice that might begin the long path to healing for these precious children." As the courthouse prepared to close for the evening with no verdict, an unexpected message came from the jury room at 5:48 p.m. They had reached a decision on all counts for both defendants. Judge Chen immediately notified all parties to return to the courtroom, and word spread rapidly through the building and to the crowds outside. Court officers established additional security measures as spectators, family members, and media representatives filed back into courtroom 3, the tension palpable as everyone took their places. Deborah Mitchell arrived with her sister and brother, deliberately leaving the children at home with relatives regardless of the outcome, having decided they had already witnessed too much trauma to be present for this moment. At 6:22 p.m., Ethan Wilson and Malik Thompson were led into the courtroom in handcuffs, both now dressed in the same suits they had worn throughout the trial. Observers noted that, for the first time since proceedings began, Ethan's composed facade showed cracks. His hands trembled slightly, and he repeatedly glanced toward his grandmother, seated behind the defense table. Malik, who had grown increasingly withdrawn as the trial progressed and the weight of evidence mounted against him, kept his eyes downcast, his shoulders slumped in apparent resignation. Their respective attorneys placed reassuring hands on their clients' shoulders as they took their seats for what would be one of the most consequential moments of their young lives. Judge Chen entered and addressed the packed courtroom with characteristic efficiency, reminding everyone that regardless of the verdict, decorum would be maintained. "There will be no outbursts, no demonstrations of any kind," she stated firmly, making eye contact with various sections of the gallery. "This is a court of law, and the dignity of these proceedings will be respected by all present." Satisfied that her instructions were understood, she then asked the jury foreperson, a 56-year-old elementary school principal, if they had reached a verdict on all counts. Upon receiving affirmation, she instructed the clerk to retrieve the verdict forms and directed the defendants to stand. The silence in the courtroom was absolute as the clerk read the verdicts for Ethan Wilson. "On the count of murder in the first degree with special circumstances, we find the defendant guilty." Similar guilty verdicts followed for each additional charge: conspiracy, home invasion, armed robbery, and all counts of child endangerment and psychological child abuse. As the litany of guilty findings continued, Ethan remained outwardly stoic, though those seated close to the defense table could see tears finally welling in his eyes, the first visible emotion he had displayed throughout the proceedings. His grandmother covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The verdicts for Malik Thompson mirrored those for his co-defendant, guilty on all counts. As the final guilty was pronounced, Malik's composure collapsed entirely, and he began to weep openly, turning to look at his mother for perhaps the first time during the trial. She returned his gaze for a brief moment before looking away, her expression unreadable. In the gallery, Deborah Mitchell closed her eyes and whispered what appeared to be a prayer, her hand clutching a photograph of her daughter that she had carried throughout the trial. Judge Chen polled each juror individually, confirming their agreement with the verdicts before thanking them for their service and dismissing them from the courtroom. She then addressed scheduling for the sentencing phase, which would begin in 3 weeks following the preparation of pre-sentencing reports. Given the defendants' ages and the nature of these convictions, the sentencing phase will require careful consideration of many factors, she explained, setting a schedule for the submission of evidence and testimony relevant to determining appropriate penalties. With the verdicts recorded and the next steps established, she adjourned the court, and the defendants were led away to be returned to the juvenile section of the detention center where they had been held throughout the trial. Outside the courthouse, reactions to the verdict played out against the backdrop of a city that had been deeply divided by the case. On the courthouse steps, Deborah Mitchell addressed the media briefly, her voice steady despite her evident emotion. "Today brings some measure of justice for my daughter and her children, but it cannot bring her back to us. These verdicts won't erase what those children saw and what they lost." She expressed gratitude to the prosecutors, police, and community members who had supported the family, adding, "Now we begin the long process of healing, of helping 3 young children rebuild their lives without their mother." Across the plaza, representatives from the Maryland Juvenile Justice Coalition held their own press conference, expressing concern about the implications of the case for youth justice reform. While we in no way diminish the horrific nature of this crime or the suffering of the Mitchell family, stated Coalition Director Rebecca Sanders, we remain concerned about a system that treats children as disposable and fails to address the root causes of youth violence. She pointed to evidence presented during the trial about both defendants' troubled backgrounds, lack of mental health services, and exposure to community violence as factors that had been acknowledged but ultimately deemed irrelevant to the question of guilt. In the days following the verdict, attention shifted to the upcoming sentencing phase, where the court would determine whether the teenagers would receive the death penalty, life without parole, or some lesser sentence that might eventually allow for release. Legal experts appearing on local and national news programs explained the complexities of sentencing juveniles in adult court, particularly in capital cases. Maryland had a complicated history with capital punishment, having abolished it in 2013 only to reinstate it in a limited form for certain heinous crimes following a series of high-profile murders in the state. The Mitchell case represented one of the first tests of the revised statute as applied to juvenile offenders. 3 weeks later, the sentencing phase began with testimony from experts on adolescent brain development, presentations about both defendants' backgrounds and psychological profiles, and heart-wrenching victim impact statements from Brianna Mitchell's family members. Deborah Mitchell described the ongoing nightmares and anxiety suffered by her grandchildren, particularly Darnell, who had assumed a protector role toward his younger siblings, but still woke screaming several nights each week. Brianna's sister spoke about the dreams and plans that had been stolen not just from Brianna, but from her children, who would grow up without their mother's guidance and love. Defense attorneys presented evidence of both defendants' troubled childhoods, with psychologists testifying about the impact of early trauma on brain development and decision-making capacity. They introduced school records showing that both teens had exhibited warning signs of serious problems for years before the crime, with little effective intervention from schools, social services, or mental health systems. Character witnesses for Ethan included his middle school basketball coach and a former neighbor who described him as a quiet, helpful boy before his mother's death dramatically altered his life trajectory. For Malik, testimony came primarily from professionals who had worked with him during his earlier involvement with the juvenile justice system, as few personal connections could be found to speak on his behalf. After 4 days of sentencing testimony, Judge Chen recessed court to consider her decision, returning on April 11th to a courtroom once again filled to capacity. In a 40-minute statement explaining her reasoning, she acknowledged the defendants' youth and difficult backgrounds while emphasizing the calculated cruelty of their crime. The evidence presented at trial established beyond any doubt that this murder was not impulsive or accidental, but rather a deliberate act designed specifically to cause maximum suffering not just to Brianna Mitchell, but to her children who were forced to witness her death, she stated. The psychological torture inflicted on those children was not incidental to the crime, but central to its purpose, to create a memorable spectacle of violence that would elevate the defendants' status in their own minds. Judge Chen addressed the complex questions surrounding juvenile culpability, noting, "Our legal system recognizes that adolescents are different from adults in significant ways, including their capacity for impulse control, their vulnerability to peer pressure, and their potential for rehabilitation. However, the law also recognizes that some crimes are so deliberate and so heinous that they demonstrate a level of moral culpability that cannot be excused by youth alone." She detailed the extensive planning that had preceded the murder, the opportunities both defendants had to reconsider their actions, and their clear awareness of the suffering they were causing, as evidenced by their own recorded words. With Ethan Wilson and Malik Thompson standing before her, Judge Chen delivered her sentence. For the crime of first-degree murder with special circumstances, this court sentences each defendant to death. Additional sentences for the remaining charges, ranging from 30 years to life imprisonment, were to run consecutively, ensuring that even if the death sentences were later commuted through appeals or policy changes, neither defendant would have any meaningful possibility of release. As the sentences were pronounced, Malik Thompson collapsed into his chair, while Ethan Wilson finally broke down completely, turning to look at his grandmother with an expression of despair that seemed to acknowledge for the first time the full reality of what he had done and what it would cost him. The sentencing of 2 teenagers to death represented an extraordinary outcome, even in a case of such brutality, immediately triggering promises of appeals from defense attorneys and heated debate about the constitutionality of capital punishment for offenders who committed their crimes as minors. As the defendants were led from the courtroom for the final time, the Mitchell family embraced each other quietly, their expressions reflecting not triumph, but the somber recognition that no court decision could truly repair what had been broken that October night when 2 teenagers decided to make themselves legendary through an act of senseless cruelty that orphaned 3 children and permanently altered countless lives. 10 years after the sentencing of Ethan Wilson and Malik Thompson, the case that had once dominated headlines and sparked intense debate about juvenile justice continued to reverberate through Baltimore and beyond. The Mitchell children, Darnell now 18, Kiara 16, and Marcus Jr. 14, remained in the care of their grandmother Deborah, who had dedicated her retirement years to raising her daughter's children while navigating the complex terrain of their trauma and recovery. The modest row house in Sandtown, Winchester, where she had raised Brianna, had been exchanged for a small 3-bedroom home in a quieter neighborhood of northeast Baltimore. Purchased with a combination of victim compensation funds, community donations, and the proceeds from a civil judgment against the families of the 2 convicted teenagers. Though the financial award from that judgment had been largely symbolic, neither defendant's family had significant assets. The gesture had provided a measure of acknowledgment that extended beyond the criminal proceedings. The children's journey through the decade following their mother's murder had been marked by both remarkable resilience and profound struggles. Darnell, who had witnessed the crime at such a formative age, had developed into a serious, academically focused young man who rarely spoke about the events of that night, but channeled his energy into his studies and his role as a youth mentor at a community center serving children who had experienced trauma. His therapist, Dr. Alicia Jenkins, who had worked with him continuously since the murder, described his progress as a testament to the human capacity for healing even after unimaginable horror, while noting that his hypervigilance and occasional nightmares remained persistent features of his life. In his senior year of high school, Darnell had been accepted to several prestigious universities, ultimately choosing to attend Johns Hopkins on a full scholarship, where he planned to study psychology with the goal of eventually helping other children who had experienced violent trauma. Kiara, who had been 6 years old when she watched her mother die, had processed her trauma differently, struggling with anxiety, attachment issues, and periodic academic difficulties throughout her elementary and middle school years. By 16, she had found her voice through writing, publishing poems in the school literary magazine that obliquely addressed her experiences and the complex emotions of growing up in the shadow of such a public tragedy. Her English teacher, Ms. Janelle Williams, had recognized Kiara's gift for expression and encouraged her to apply to a prestigious summer writing program for high school students, where her work had received recognition and opened new possibilities for her future. Though still prone to periods of withdrawal and emotional volatility, Kiara had developed close friendships and begun to articulate a tentative vision for her own life that honored her mother's memory while claiming her own identity. The youngest Mitchell child, Marcus Jr., had perhaps the most complicated relationship to the tragedy, having been only 4 years old at the time and retaining fewer direct memories of both the crime and his mother. His understanding had been shaped largely by stories told by his siblings and grandmother, by the annual memorial ceremonies held on Brianna's birthday, and by the inescapable reality of growing up as one of those children in a community that had never fully forgotten the case. A talented athlete with his mother's warm smile, Marcus had struggled with behavioral issues in elementary school, acting out in ways that child psychologists identified as manifestations of his early trauma. By 14, with the support of consistent therapy, a dedicated male mentor through Big Brothers Big Sisters and his grandmother's unwavering love, he had developed greater emotional regulation and found constructive outlets through basketball and music. Deborah Mitchell, now in her early 70s, had become an unexpected but powerful advocate for both victims' rights and juvenile justice reform, positions that many initially found contradictory, but which she insisted were complementary aspects of a holistic approach to preventing future tragedies. "Vengeance doesn't heal anything," she often stated in community forums and legislative hearings. But neither does ignoring the reality of what violent crime does to families and communities. Her perspective had been shaped not only by her daughter's murder, but by her decade of raising traumatized children while simultaneously following the appeals process that had repeatedly forced the family to relive the details of Brianna's death. The legal journey of the case had been complex and contentious, with multiple appeals filed on behalf of both defendants, challenging various aspects of the trial and sentencing. The most significant legal development had come 3 years after the original sentences were imposed, when the United States Supreme Court issued a landmark ruling in Jenkins v. Ohio that categorically prohibited the death penalty for offenders who were under 18 at the time of their crimes, regardless of the severity of those crimes. This decision had automatically commuted the death sentences of Ethan Wilson and Malik Thompson to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, though subsequent appeals had sought to challenge even these revised sentences based on evolving standards regarding juvenile life sentences. The most recent legal challenge, filed by attorneys from the Equal Justice Initiative on behalf of both defendants, argued that mandatory life without parole for juvenile offenders constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. This appeal, pending before the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, had once again thrust the case into public discourse, with advocates on both sides citing the Mitchell murder as either the perfect example of why some juveniles deserve permanent incarceration, or why even the most troubled young offenders deserve some possibility of redemption after substantial punishment. Legal experts predicted the case might eventually reach the Supreme Court as part of the ongoing national reconsideration of juvenile sentencing practices. Ethan Wilson and Malik Thompson, now 26 and 27 years old respectively, had spent the decade since their convictions in separate maximum security prisons within the Maryland Department of Corrections. Their paths during incarceration had diverged significantly, reflecting the different ways they had processed their crime and punishment. Ethan, according to prison records and reports from the chaplain who had worked with him for 7 years, had experienced what appeared to be genuine remorse after his late teens, participating actively in available educational programs and eventually earning his GED and completing several college courses through a prison education initiative. He had begun writing letters of apology to the Mitchell family during his 5th year of incarceration, though Deborah Mitchell had chosen not to read them, stating that she might be ready to consider forgiveness in God's time, not mine. Malik Thompson's incarceration had followed a more troubled path, marked by disciplinary infractions, periods of isolation, and resistance to rehabilitation programs during his early years in prison. Prison psychologists had diagnosed him with several mental health conditions that had gone untreated before his incarceration, including post-traumatic stress disorder related to his own childhood experiences of neglect and exposure to violence. By his mid-20s, however, Malik had begun engaging with mental health services and educational opportunities, a change that coincided with the arrival of a new prison psychiatrist who specialized in trauma-informed approaches to working with young offenders. In a rare interview granted to a criminology researcher studying juvenile lifers, Malik had expressed that he couldn't understand the reality of what he had done until he got older and my brain changed, a statement that both resonated with and complicated scientific research on adolescent brain development and moral reasoning. The case had left an indelible mark on Baltimore's criminal justice system and community services. The Baltimore Police Department had implemented new protocols for handling child witnesses to violent crime, directly informed by lessons learned during the Mitchell murder investigation. Detective Harold Jenkins, who had led that investigation, had developed a training program for officers on trauma-informed interviewing techniques for child witnesses before retiring from the force and accepting a position teaching criminal justice at the University of Maryland. Similarly, the state's attorney's office had created a specialized unit dedicated to cases involving juvenile victims or witnesses, with prosecutors receiving additional training in child development and the neurological impacts of trauma on memory and testimony. Perhaps the most tangible legacy of the case could be found in the Brianna Mitchell Community Center, established 5 years after her death in the East Baltimore neighborhood where she had lived and died. Funded through a combination of city allocations, federal grants, and private donations, the center offered after-school programs, mental health services, parenting support groups, and youth mentorship initiatives specifically designed to address the factors that had contributed to the tragedy. from the lack of supervision and positive influences in the defendants' lives to the limited mental health resources available to families in crisis. The center's mission statement, displayed prominently in its entrance hall alongside a portrait of Brianna, captured this dual focus: healing trauma and preventing violence through community, opportunity, and care. On the 10th anniversary of the verdicts, a panel discussion at the University of Baltimore School of Law brought together key figures from the case, including former prosecutor Eleanor Parker, now a judge, defense attorney James Washington, now directing a juvenile justice reform organization, Detective Jenkins, and, most powerfully, Darnell Mitchell, making his first public appearance to discuss the case that had shaped his childhood. The discussion, moderated by a nationally recognized expert on trauma and resilience, explored how the case had influenced policy changes, professional practices, and public understanding of both juvenile crime and victims' experiences. Darnell, speaking with the measured thoughtfulness that had become his hallmark, offered perhaps the most nuanced perspective. This case has always been presented as a binary. Either you support harsh punishment for juvenile offenders, or you excuse their actions because of their age and circumstances. The reality is more complicated. I lost my mother to an act of senseless violence, but I also recognize that different choices at many points along the way might have prevented that violence entirely. As Baltimore continued to grapple with issues of violence, poverty, and limited opportunity, the same conditions that had formed the backdrop for the tragedy a decade earlier, the case remained a touchstone in discussions about the city's future. For families in similar neighborhoods, the Mitchell children's resilience offered a measure of hope that trauma, while transformative, need not be definitively determining. For policymakers, the case underscored the complex interplay between individual choices, systemic failures, and community resources that shape the trajectory of young lives. And for the wider public, the story continued to challenge simplistic narratives about crime and punishment, victim and perpetrator, justice and mercy in a society still struggling to balance accountability with the possibility of redemption. In her modest home in northeast Baltimore, surrounded by photographs of 3 generations of her family, Deborah Mitchell marked the anniversary quietly, lighting a candle beside her daughter's picture, as she did every year. Brianna would be proud of her children, she told a visitor, her voice soft but steady. They carry her spirit with them, her determination to build something good even when life is hard. That's her real legacy, not the tragedy that took her from us, but the love that continues through them. Outside her window, in a city still scarred by violence but also animated by resilience and possibility, another generation of children played on the sidewalks and dreamed of their futures, their paths yet to be determined by the complex interplay of choices, circumstances, and community that would shape their lives, just as it had shaped the lives of 2 teenagers whose fateful decisions one October night had reverberated through a decade of consequence and reflection.